Hello, welcome to Scary Thoughts, Horror, Philosophy, Culture. I'm Mark Cate.
And I'm Chad Lott.
This is episode 107. We will be talking about Spider Baby, the Jack Hill film from 1967, and we'll also be talking about The Munsters, the Rob Zombie film from 2022. You can email us at whatthe@scarythoughts.org, WHATTHE, and nothing to plug, right?
Well, sort of like something for you that passed but is ongoing in San Francisco is like how we even came to talk about Spider Baby, which is Old Devil Saloon.
Old Devil Moon.
Sorry, I thought it was Old Devil Saloon. So bad.
It's slightly saloony.
Yeah.
So the bar in the Mission District of San Francisco called the Old Devil Moon.
Yeah. So on Wednesday nights, I guess for October, I don't know if it's going to keep going on.
October 2022. I think that's it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It seemed like the place that this could just go on forever at.
Kind of.
But they're having like various like people who talk about horror host a movie outdoor in the back patio, which is really fun. And it is heated, which is amazing. And it's like well heated. It's so pedestrian to mention that. But if you don't want to go out because it's cold on Wednesday night, it's actually
well. Additionally, it's midnight movies at 7 p.m. So if you don't like going out late, it's also very convenient.
It's phenomenal. Like for all the reasons I don't go to shit, this sort of answered them. You know, but you did Spider Baby. You were the first.
Yeah.
You weren't the first one, but
no, second one.
Yeah.
But I showed Screen Spider Baby the other night with Elgyra, very butch co-host. And yeah, it seemed to be received really well. And it's one of my favorites. So it was a kind of a treat to introduce a bunch of people to it, and definitely got a lot of people asking, how the hell did you find this movie?
Well, what's interesting about it is, as like, how the hell do you find it? I had never seen it. It was not the movie that I remembered. Like when you said, have you seen Spider Baby? I was thinking of a completely different movie.
Kiss of the Spider Woman or something?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking of. Yeah. And even though it's not at all the same anyway, but this movie, there's so many things that have been obviously borrowed by other horror filmmakers that it feels utterly familiar.
Yeah.
It's almost like when you watch Joe Dorowski's Dune, and you're like, oh, I've seen all these elements in all these other movies. And it has that sort of feel to it. And it's also just, it's a real gem of what I would consider indie auteur folk filmmaking. Shot in 12 days. The guy wrote and directed it. It's got this fucking weirdo cast. Like if you're a fan of Tim Burton's Ed Wood movie, I think that this movie feels like the kind of movie that could have been made by them.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Just really quick before we go forward, I think we should mention spoilers ahead. We're just going to spoil everything. So that's probably the only caveat we need to throw into the intro here.
Yeah. And if you're looking to see this film, I guess it's in the public domain in some weird way. And so the pre-code, the Hollywood YouTube channel Pizza Flix, Flix, has it on there in a pretty good version.
Yeah, it looked all right.
Yeah.
It's also been released in like double DVD Blu-ray pack with a lot of additional stuff that I have not seen, but I've read excerpts from. Sounds super interesting.
Save your money.
Yeah, just watch the movie and listen to our podcast. I mean, so I'm not really sure how I came across this movie. I think I saw the poster and maybe a still from it. It seems that the two girls in the cast really prefigure the aesthetic of Riot Girl and Kinder Horror, right? Like these slightly unhinged, tough girls in baby doll dresses or clothing that does not match their age and is definitely sort of thrift store chic is very iconic to this movie and certainly iconic to the Riot Girl moment. And it sort of made me want to know what this movie was. And I saw it for the first time a long time ago. It's definitely very singular. There's really not much like it. It's also a really schlocky film, but everybody in the cast is giving everything. There's not a dull performer on screen. A lot of the actors seem to be, maybe they're in different movies. Like Lon Chaney is not in the same movie as Sid Haig is not in the same movie as the lawyer Schlocker.
Yeah,
but they're all just tearing up the scenery in every moment.
Schlocker is like He wandered. It's as if he wandered in off of a Marx Brothers movie.
Oh, for sure.
Like completely. And then Lon Chaney's giving like what would have been his like Tarantino Oscar performance.
Yeah.
You know, just out of nowhere.
Yeah.
And then the two girls that play the sisters, there's just definitely something very like interesting about the way they look. They look like the kind of girls that could be on like a Duotone Smiths or Belle and Sebastian album cover.
Yeah, totally. And also, the delivery man in the first scene is sort of like old-timey comedy, whereas the girls are very dry humor. They're like the entire approach to humor is, I think, of a different style.
It's very Daria.
Oh, yeah. I didn't think of that. Totally. I think it's worth talking about when this movie came out, what its style is, and how it sits within the canon and chronology of Hollywood and horror cinema. It came out or it was made. So it was made in 64 and didn't come out until like 67, 68. It had a lot of problems in completion and distribution. But not only had so much changed in those 3 to 4 years, this movie was already behind the times when it was made. And horror cinema at the time it was being made was in a bit of a fallow period. It seems audiences were kind of getting tired of the Hammer, Peter Cushing, castles and vampires style horror, the very melodramatic horror, but was also getting tired of the like teenagers getting chased by a swamp monster drive-in movie fare, and the revolutions in cinema provided by Polanski, Wes Craven, John Carpenter hadn't happened yet.
Yeah. And then Polanski was really like a one-man A24. Like after Rosemary's Baby, like everybody had to like up their game.
Fully. And so this movie was kind of the earlier moment. And I think that is really indicated by two things quite significantly. One is that the presence of Lon Chaney Jr., like his career was way over by this time. He had descended deeply into alcoholism. He'd really retreated. He wasn't doing much. He was a total has-been. And he's in this movie.
And he's great in it.
And he kills.
Yeah.
He's so strong. And then also Matten Moreland, the black actor who is, and you know, this is something I'll get into a little more. He is the black guy dies first character. You know, there's one black character in this movie and he is murdered. He is the first, his death is the first scene of the movie. And he cut his teeth as an actor being this sort of like black caricature that by the early 60s had fallen out of favor on one hand because it was a style of the past, but also black critics had sort of like had enough of this shit from cinema. But the thing is, he's a working actor, you know, he's built this career on this thing that was always questionable, but at this point there's more increasing pushback. And then he's included this in this film doing that sort of caricature scared black man thing and then killed in the first scene. But he's amazing in it. He's great. He's so funny and weird. But I think that the inclusion of him, he's a has-been and people are tired of, and Lon Chaney Jr., who is a has-been and people are tired of, are both in this movie that is after its time. And so I think that out of its time thing, we're used to celebrating things that are ahead of their time, and this thing is behind the times in some ways that are really dubious and problematic, but in some ways are like really fascinating.
Yeah, I noticed a lot of like the camera work felt very like TV show to me. Like, I mean, obviously, like they probably had a pretty small, but it felt like old TV for the time. So like I felt like I was watching the strangest episode of Nick at Night. Or not the Nick at Night was a show, but like, you know what I mean? It's like this thing I could just see somebody being like, let's just run this at midnight Nick at Night, you know, it just is of that era. Yeah. And it has so many like visual things that show up, like the giant Grey Gardens mansion. I mean, I know that kind of existed before, but I wonder what was in the air, because like you have this, and then you have the Munsters and the Addams family all come out around the same time, and they all have the big old house with the suit of armor in the corner kind of deal.
Yeah.
And it's like, I wonder if there was like a famous example of that. Like maybe like somebody had done like a Life magazine tour of the Hearst Castle, and it was at that time old enough and weird enough to be kind of like a mystery house or something like that. I wonder.
Right.
Because this is like a really in between. You're going from like man in the gray flannel suit, Don Draper times to like hippie times. So you never really hear a whole lot about like the early 60s. Like it seems like everything was like bubbling underneath. Like people are out giving away LSD all over the country at this point, and stuff. But the reason why I mentioned that like kind of like bubbling, dangerous youth movement is that's not at all part of this movie. And often when you have like a murder redneck hillbilly incest family, there's a tension with the youth of the time, and
as represented by Chainsaw not many years later.
Yeah.
A bunch of loose kids who just want to be groovy.
Yeah, but this is like it's hard to know who you had this in your talk. It's like, is this movie about gentrification? And I would say no, but but the villains, victims of this movie are a part of the family that's coming to take the money that they think is due them from these weird people who are living in their own fucked up way. But, their own fucked up way is they're murderers. So as a society, you would probably be pretty much against that. And you wouldn't be so against these upwardly mobile types just trying to like get some property. I don't know. It's weird. Like if it had been later, you could imagine like the two sisters being more hippie flower child psychos or something like that.
Yeah.
Or maybe not.
But I think that it's hard not to think about this in terms of gentrification, because it's like, you hate gentrification? Well, do you have a right to murder the people that step on your property, which is stand your ground laws? And obviously it's this like murderous, cannibalistic family. So there's probably a line of death that stretches through time, but they don't murder anybody in the film that doesn't step on their property and try to do them harm.
Like a spider.
Yeah.
But
it is literally like, as soon as people step into the web, they're risking their lives. Don't step in the web and you're fine. And so the question is, well, it's like spider's got a spider, right? Do you have a right to judge people living on their own terms, on their own land? And where do you draw the line where that becomes unacceptable? Do you support stand your ground laws, right? I think it's pretty hard to defend cannibalism, but do you defend the right to kill someone who comes on your property meaning harm? If the answer is yes, then a lot of this film is defensible.
Look, I'm all about lighting people up who come into your house, as you know.
And I am not yet. I am I'm sort of advocating for it.
But I would say that the idea of this being gentrification framed, I don't think is correct. And it's really for like a pedantic point, which is like, I think this has more to do with like family law and how things are inherited and passed on. And
good estate planning.
Yeah, this is all about estate planning.
Yeah,
and
they did not have a good. The father tried to have the estate all laid out, but it obviously created conflict.
Yeah, but it also doesn't seem to be that there is a will. There's like a promise from the caretaker, which is weird. Like, why would anybody? I guess people do weird shit all the time, but like, maybe he was left with some money. Like he has that Duesenberg. That's pretty
sweet.
That's like the Rolls Royce Phantom of its time.
Yeah.
One of the trivia things I found interesting was Lon Chaney got paid the most. He got this movie had a $60,000 budget. He got $2,500, which is a pretty big chunk.
Yeah.
Even for this time. All the other actors got $100 a day, which was the same cost of renting that car per day. So that car was $100 a day. But I was thinking about that. $100 a day back then, that's like a fucking shitload of money for a car.
Yeah.
But then again, it was like a rolling, it was like a limo pretty much. So
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
But to talk further about encroachment, gentrification, and what's right, I think it's worth noting that this is, I can't think of another example, so I'm just going to make this statement. And if I'm wrong, please, email in and correct me. But I think this is the first Cannibal Family movie.
Correct me, Daddy.
Gross. So, now we have Raw, House of a Thousand Corpses, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, obviously, The Hills Have Eyes. And I think this is the first one. But as far as a horror family drama, this was made in 1964, the same year that the Munsters, which we'll talk about later, and the Addams Family came out on TV. I wonder how much this movie was influenced by those two TV shows. Things moved pretty quick, so it's entirely possible that Jack Hill saw the Munsters on TV, saw the Addams Family on TV, and immediately, like a month later, made this movie. Or he made it all before those screened. Who knows?
I mean, it could have even affected something like just the set decoration. This movie has a lot of similar elements to Texas Chainsaw and even the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which is a cannibal family movie, basically.
True.
And it reminded me also of when Sam Raimi was talking about Evil Dead, and he said like they made the entire inside of the house look like the house from Texas Chainsaw Massacre. That was their inspiration. And so then you're getting into like Baudrillard's copy of a copy territory now. So it's like, okay, well, the Chainsaw Massacre house was probably a copy of the Spider Baby house, which was a copy of maybe the Munsters and I remember like when I was a little kid going to places and you would see more like just shit on the walls. Like there would be like ducks and like two axes and a family crest. Like that seemed to be like more of a decor style. Like people kept the things that their family had just left around or something like that. But you don't see that. Like now, if my family sends me anything, I'm just like, fuck, right to the trash can.
I also like how this plays into the history of what we've come to think of as rural horror. Usually those movies take place somewhere in the South. I think for dubious political reasons of coastal elites making cinema and making judgments on the people in the flyover states. But also, I think there's a fair assessment of, this movie is about the Mary syndrome, which we'll talk about later, but it's also about like what can happen when people aren't socialized. What happens when people are so outside the system, not the system, so outside of society. What do you get? And you're able to be more and more detached from the greater world the further you are away from it. This is a family that lives on this locked off, distant property. Not in the South, as many films depict that sort of scenario for horror effect, but they are removed. And this is the result. And that is a fair, frightening thing. That's a pretty robust source for horror. It's a different kind of unknown. Like what's out there? What's possible? What are people really thinking when they're that detached from good, respectable people and an educational system? I mean, I also made the joke the other night that this movie is what happens when you homeschool your children. But I think that behind that joke is like a slight truism. Like this is what happens when your family is deeply ill and you don't seek treatment.
Yeah,
right?
But then like look around at the kids in San Francisco. That's what happens when you don't homeschool your kids. So when you let the state school your kids. So who knows?
Oh, man.
Like, I bet these kids are at least interesting in a Montessori sort of way. I mean, look, the girl made her own spider web.
It's pretty crafty.
Yeah.
She knows what to do with an ear.
Yeah. I mean, probably right now there's some equally as useless kid from a normal family just drooling onto his Minecraft keyboard. The whole, like, flowers for Algernon thing is kind of funny, too. Like, but I was thinking about, like, the way the disease works. Okay, it kicks on at 10 and then starts aging them backwards. So by the time they're, like, the girls' ages, they're like 5 or 6 mentally?
Maybe.
Or, something like that, yeah.
But it might not be linear necessarily. It might not be like each year forward you subtract a year.
Yeah.
It might not be a perfect reflection of development.
Yeah, it also seems that like at a certain point of like lack of development, that you just become like a feral monster.
Yes.
Yeah.
And turn cannibal.
Yeah.
And you start mutating. So one of the, I think it's uncle, whatever, has sort of turned werewolfish. We get a shot of him at the end.
Good for him.
That's fine. I mean, he's living in a pit, though. Can't be too happy. Well, let's talk about the condition. Another thing that inspired me to want to share this movie is because I'm studying to be a therapist at Golden Gate University. I'm taking currently the class psychopathology, which is just basically, it's just memorizing the DSM-5, which is, I have right here, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And the DSM is an attempt to comprehensively outline all mental conditions in order to, once you diagnose that condition, you can know how to proceed with the individual who may have those conditions, may meet the criteria for those conditions.
And how much of that book is based on reproducible science?
I mean, I've read a lot of the studies that led to that book because it's super fascinating. Yeah. A lot.
Yeah, that's good.
But it's all, I mean, I think so. It's so funny when you mention the DSM that people immediately want to fight you. Like everybody wants to push back against that book because they either are mad that it was made originally by white patriarchs who think that women are neurotic and gays are mentally ill. And, maybe people further to the right who think like people aren't to be controlled. People should be free, whatever. I'm rounding off a lot of corners here. But I think what is important to know is that I have not come across a single article or person who takes the DSM as a Bible. It is very clear and very known and very understood that this book is the best we've got so far, and it is always in development. The second it's published, we already have new studies that undermine its credibility, and that's built into it. That's an understanding, and it is not inflexible. The book is incredibly flexible. It's all about interpretation. This is about look, if a person meets the conditions for bipolar disorder, you can help them a lot better knowing that they meet those conditions than if they meet the conditions for schizophrenia because you treat someone who is schizophrenic a different way. And it's not absolute, but it's better than just groping around blindly and not having the guide.
I read most of the DSM-4.
Yeah.
I just read it.
It's super interesting.
Yeah, because there's an article a few years ago that was basically like the DSM-4 is a postmodern dystopian novel. And so the article sort of made a case for why read David Foster Wallace's tennis interpretation of this when you could just go right to the source.
Oh, that's good.
And for some reason, I kind of I just took that sort of literally. I actually didn't know what the DSM-4 was when I bought it. And they just had it, at a college, they'll have an older version of it or whatever that, is $4. And I was like, oh, cool. I'll get this thing, and just read it. And yeah, a lot of it reminded me of, I'm listening to this book about neurodivergent thinking right now. And some of it reminds me a little bit of and I had the same experience when you're reading the DSM-5 where it's sort of when you're or the DM-4, you're when you go online to look up if you have cancer or not, it seems like everything seems so vague enough. They're oh, that could apply to me. That could apply to me. And it reminded me of the Amazing Randy thing where he to disprove astrology, he gives everybody the same, astrology fortune. Is it a fortune? Is that
reading?
What you get? Reading, yeah. And he's raise your hand if you think it's exactly like you. And everybody raises their hand. And he's pass it one back. And everybody passes it back. And they realize they all have the same thing. And they've been made a fool of. A lot of that felt some of it's very specific. There's if you have A, B, C, and D, but not E, you have X.
Exactly.
Yeah, that sort of diagnostic manual. But that part reminds me of the old Haynes manuals for repairing cars. If your car will not start, check to see if it has spark. It's just an interesting, it seems impossible. You could actually have a real diagnostic tool to something as crazy as the storm inside people's minds.
Yeah, but there are patterns enough that they're traceable. there is enough consistency that being able to trace those consistencies can be helpful, right? It's certainly a fallible system, but healing bones isn't 100% absolute perfect science either. The mind is just more chaotic, but it doesn't mean that it is absolute chaos and there's no pattern and there's no good to be done from tracing what patterns we can glean and attempt to constantly improve our understanding of what those diagnoses, what those cognitive processes are and do.
Yeah. I think my like big bristling at the whole thing is it just sort of, it's not so much that like, I'm like, oh, it's a failed system and it's not real science. It's not so much that, because I think everything's pretty loosey-goosey when you start digging into it, you know?
For sure.
I think for me, it's just that it affirms this thing that I'm disappointed seems to be true, which is like people just really aren't that different. Like ultimately, you know, people just aren't that special. Like the chances of somebody being pretty special are low. Like, because even the way you go nuts is like a standard way of going nuts, you know? And it's interesting. Right. I think about this a lot because there's a lot of overlap with marketing and psychology because you're trying to figure out what make people tick for special reasons. And even in the 50s, there was a lot of psychology and marketing. Like that's my favorite psychology marketing stuff because it was done with the most evil studies. But yeah, it's just like, it seems like weird that people's brains work exactly the same across so many fields. Like, I don't know. I find that disappointing.
It's often true. Yep.
Yeah.
We're not so special.
Yeah.
But getting back to Spider Baby, the movie starts off with this framing device, the old framing device that
so good.
Mid-century horror movies would always do. I mean, my interpretation of it is that if our listeners don't know exactly what we're talking about, I know if you're listening to this podcast, you've seen the Rocky Horror Picture Show and you remember the criminologist, the man with no neck who explains how depraved what you're about to see is and make sure that you have no questions. Its morality is of a dubious nature. That was not totally standard, but not infrequent in mid-century horror where a white patriarchal authority behind a desk or something like that would explain what you were about to see.
I think this like comes from like the epistolary nature of horror movies. Or horror novels, you know, like in H.P. Lovecraft, there would be like, I am writing this letter to let you know what horrors I have seen and why my hair is white now. Yeah.
That's totally fair. My interpretation of how it functions is that if you just made a horror movie, it would be depraved. If you had a white man explain what you were about to see is depraved, you go, okay, the filmmakers are not endorsing. The filmmakers are creating a moral framework around this, a good Christian American moral framework that makes me not believe that the filmmakers are depraved, that there's something wholesome at the heart of viewing this film.
I felt when I watched this that this could be a useful framing device for the future, for the sensitive future. Because essentially you're right. You're like, it gets to be like, man, it gets fucking crazy here. And it's like, but we're just looking at a thing. Yeah. So like, you know, like when people think a comedian that has really dark humor is like a really dark person. So like people like Anthony Jeselnik is not literally a murderer.
Right.
You know, but it is his act. And there's something about comedians, and I don't want to get into the business of defending comedians. I could give a fuck. They're making a lot of money right now. But there's this idea that like one of the incorrect ways that people interpret comedy is that the person is literally true, literally saying those things, and not saying a thing to just sort of like make you laugh by hearing something unexpected. And
if you want to know that that's not true, look at Bill Cosby.
Completely, right? The perfect example, although the kind of the negative example.
Yes.
But so the framing device sort of, you know, you think about when you go to see a movie by like Julia Ducournau and it's like totally fucking depraved and crazy, there's sort of this conversation about like her. And instead of like, or even in black metal where it's like, you're just some nerd, but you've made this completely depraved album. And it's like, then people discover the depraved work of art and do the math backwards. And they're like, oh, you're actually a fucking terrible person because you came up with this thing. Like if I wrote an album called like Murder All Black Jews or something like that, crazy, that would just me trying to think of like the most offensive thing I could say right there. Right. And it's just looking at the world, thinking what's terrible and putting it together. It's pretty easy, right? But you could see somebody be like, oh, the fact that you even came up with that makes you a fucking terrible person. You know, there's a little bit of that in the air right now.
Yeah.
Or that like, you're not, like when people like look at Patrick Bateman from American Psycho, like at the time, they're like, oh, this character is so fucking terrible. We have to ban Bret Easton Ellis. It's like,
yes.
Well, isn't it just interesting that this guy has created this like all-time great villain and you're in their mind? Like, that's just an interesting thing. So I think you could have like, you know, like the liberal version of this where it's like,
Fully.
you know, you're going to see lots of crazy misogyny and all that, like kind of almost how
Trigger
like,
warnings.
Yeah, you almost like your intro talk was almost like a trigger warning for this film. But I thought it was funny, like revealing the true nature of humanity is the thing that got the biggest laugh was when Lon Chaney, when they're asking like, what's wrong with the kids? And he's like, well, you might call them retarded.
Yes.
And everybody laughed. I was like,
know.
oh, you fuckers, you guys are so full of shit.
Yeah. I know.
Yeah. I think it's because of how gravelly his R is when he says he's like retarded. You're like, oh, it's just.
Well, I also think that there is a thing where, speaking of stand-up comedians, I think it's Bill Burr was complaining about someone being, that Sean Connery is being canceled and just how ridiculous that is. Like, of course, Sean Connery said questionable things about women. Look at the time he lived in. Why are you wasting your time on this really obvious target? I think that older things generally are able to dodge cancellation in a certain sense, you know, like current people couldn't get away with what South Park is getting away with, right? Like a South Park couldn't happen right now, but it already exists. So it doesn't get a pass. I don't know what the expression would be, but I wonder if hearing someone from a movie from 67 say retarded, it's like it gets a pass. And so it's able to be funny, as opposed to if a stand-up comedian currently was talking like that, those same people would probably grouse at what's being said. I'm making assumptions, but I don't think I'm far off.
Yeah. But then there's also the thing of like, you know, there's this kind of like complaint about like, if you like a thing, therefore you were like the people who made it. Like, for example, like say you're a fan of Black Rifle Coffee, you know, I've ordered their coffee and it's actually pretty good, you know, because I was like, I thought Range 15 was really funny. So I ordered some coffee to sort of support Range 15 because I pirated it, you know. I was like, it's like this math makes sense to me. And then, you know, they're not like perfect by any means. And they even have like hardcore conservative fans that don't like them because they sort of like distance themselves from Kyle Rittenhouse. Like why wouldn't you as a brand distance yourself from fucking Kyle Rittenhouse? You know, I mean, even if you're like, I mean, not to open that up at all, but there are reasons why you would want to, even if you fully supported what he did, there were reasons why you would want to, you know? And this is, I bring up Black Rifle because I don't want it to seem like it's only like a thing that happens on the left. This particular type of like finger wagging, like it happens, everybody does it to something else at some point, you know, but, I could see somebody being like, oh, I really like that movie Spider Baby. And you're like, well, what is it about it that you like? You know, like to me, it's just interesting to see how far films have come. And I love hammy acting. Like this type of acting, I just absolutely adore.
We'll get into that more with the Munsters for sure.
Yeah.
While we're talking about problematic shit, there are two things I would love to touch on. One is that, so the Matt and Moreland character, the black character who gets murdered in the first scene. So we can look at that as problematic, and I think we'd be right. And I think that there are a lot of good reasons that is, you know, well, it does persist. The black character being the first to die in a horror thriller is still happening. It's not gone. But
I have a different opinion about the first death in a horror movie being a bad thing.
I want to hear that before I go on.
I keep going with this, but like I have like an opinion that I think like destabilizes.
I think I already know how to push back against whatever. Okay, just the quick thing is that interestingly, Jack Hill, the writer and director of Spider Baby, who wrote and directed that scene, within a couple of years made Coffee and Foxy Brown, both starring Pam Grier. Yeah. Like two of the biggest, most remarkable films in the history of blaxploitation. Granted, they were not made entirely by black people the way a lot of blaxploitation was, but they are in the canon, right? I think that is a super fascinating pivot. And there's part of me that wonders, and this is total speculation, I'm just grasping here. Quentin Tarantino made Reservoir Dogs, not a single woman in it. Then he made Pulp Fiction. Female representation in that film is really fucked.
They're all idealized film starlets, basically.
Yes, or the wife that is never actually even fucking on camera. She's just a hovering, nagging threat.
Oh, a wife that's not around? That sounds like a dream.
Moving on. And I wonder if people pushed back on Tarantino and was like, go fuck yourself. And he did a little soul searching and came up with Kill Bill 1 and 2, which are awesome. I don't know the man, but I wonder if he was like, okay, I hear you. Here's what I got for you. And came up with like one of the coolest women action heroes ever made, you know? I wonder if Jack Hill in the time between 64 and when was, I don't remember when Foxy Brown and Coffee came out. Not that much longer, really, like within a decade. I wonder if he had a sort of come to Jesus moment about representation of Black people in cinema, the way most of America was, really.
Look how much has changed in the last few years, you know, like just for representation in general, you know, like you got Lady Ghostbusters, you got Lady Thors.
Lady Hulks.
Twerking Hulks.
What?
I'm not against the twerking She-Hulk.
There's a what?
There's a scene where She-Hulk is twerking with, I believe, Cardi B. I haven't seen the show because I'm not into Marvel TV so much these days, but
that's weird.
Yeah.
So what were you going to say about, I have another thing to say about problematic bullshit, but.
Yeah, I mean, this doesn't really, okay. So there's a whole idea that being the first person killed is like some sort of shameful thing. Like that's the thing. Like, oh, they're the most, you know, they're the shittiest, weakest character, therefore they would die the first. And because it's always a Black person, it's like film always saying that like the Black character is the weakest character. And that's even in the, you know, it just doesn't seem to be true, right? Like, and there's plenty of action movies where the toughest, fucking coolest character gets shot in the face right away. You know, like Suicide Squad, tons of fun characters die right away. Like,
right.
I've been thinking about the first death in a horror movie from like a story, Dan Harmon's Story Circle, classic hero's journey myth. Like, so if you think of a horror movie as a type of myth or a horror in general, the first death is the moment you know that things are going off the rails. Like it's entering the void, it's crossing the threshold. So I think that there's sort of like the character that is the first to die that causes the viewer to cross the threshold has to be, you have to really sort of identify with that character quite a lot. And I think that's why they're usually doing something silly or having sex or, you know, something, it's always something very human, you know, like going to the fridge and getting a beer and then the axe goes through your head or whatever. Like so no matter what, you, the viewer, are sort of like experiencing your first death. Like, and it's sort of the death of the hero. Like, anyway, so I think the fact that like a character dies there, if you think of it as like an important death instead of like a shameful death, it sort of changes the feeling. Should they all be Black? Of course not. But I think, especially in this one, like, because the character dies in a threshold, you know, it's like you're going from the outside world to the inside world of this house. So I think it's actually pretty stylistic in this case. But yeah, that's just what I've been thinking about the first death.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting. I think that parallels with and I'm using the word more traditionally problematic of what you just said that is interesting is, for example, gay and trans characters being the murderers in cinema, right? It's a weird, problematic part of Hollywood history that you can only count on your hands before a certain point in Hollywood. A couple of trans characters ever, and they're all murderers, right? And that's obviously a real problem, but at the same time, a lot of them are awesome characters, like really thrilling. It's sort of the Disney evil queen thing. You know, most Disney representation of women were docile girls or powerful evil witches, which is a problem, but the evil witches were awesome and the most memorable part of things about most of the early history of Disney cinema. And I think to your point, I think there's a similar thing where I think that what you're saying is interesting and possibly true. And at the same time, what happens when you kill off the black character in the first scene, or if the black character is the first to go, you don't have to have black character anymore. You don't have to have them actually represented anymore. They're just gone, and you can focus more on the white characters surviving and get more and more of screen time invested in white people than possibly being invested in a black person and how they might persevere through a film.
Yeah. But I would say the plot of this film, or the events of the film, are, to quote Boston from Race Trader, it's white people shit. It's a inbred, decadent, rich family dealing with their shit. So I think, this is some honky territory, man. Like
Fair.
This film. So maybe just get rid of everybody else except for these inbred honkies.
Maybe.
Yeah. It takes place in California, right?
I don't know where it takes place, but that's where it was shot in LA.
Yeah.
The other thing that I think is interesting, it's sort of a bait and switch, is that Aunt Emily is raped by Ralphie outdoors. And then the focus of the action is just completely elsewhere for a really long time. And we finally cut back to her, and she wakes up, possibly unconscious, probably knocked out or something.
Yeah.
And raped. It's hard to say. But she's immediately like, Ralph. And she's like doing the thing that far too many films have represented, especially older films, which is like women just need to be raped into submission and love. She is wandering around trying to find him because she's been so seduced by him. And that's so fucked up. But the thing that happens in the movie that is kind of hard to see because it happens so fast, like I've noticed a lot of criticism about what I'm describing online, where people don't actually notice what happens, is the second she finds him, she screams his name, dives at him, drives her thumbs into his eyes, and basically kills him.
Yeah.
So it was a way to get her revenge. But that part is so like awesomely quick that if you blink, you might miss that it was a ploy the whole time.
Yeah, they don't do the thing that you normally do, which is a shot of the body. Yeah, it's just a weird, for whatever reason, it's not there.
Right. Like I really appreciate it, but it seems to be a thing that currently you would have to drive home really hard that's what happened. Whereas in exploitation cinema, things tend to be a little more frayed around the edges.
Yeah.
A little more ambiguous oftentimes.
Yeah. Well, it is an incest family, Mark.
It is. Yeah. Truly. Wait, was there something we were going to talk about and then?
No, now there's just like things about it. They're just kind of like the opening theme song is like totally unique and bizarre.
It's sort of a Monster Mash-ish.
Yeah. It sounds a bit like the Monster Mash, but like it has like a real Shel Silverstein rhythm to it.
Oh, yeah.
And then it's also sort of like recounting the events of the film. So
yes,
it's straight up telling you, it's almost like the weird Hollywood jingle version of a novelization book.
Yeah.
It's so peculiar. And then like, I love how it's Lon Chaney singing it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like not quite on the beat.
No.
But it catches it sometimes. It has like a very like, it's almost, this is being extraordinarily generous to it, but it's almost like how like Wu-Tang beats are like a little bit behind and then the MCs like hit the notes that matter.
It's funny you said that. I was going to joke that it pre-saw hip hop by 20 years.
Yeah. Like Lon Chaney is definitely the old dirty bastard of this film.
I also love the line, what is it? Frankenstein, werewolf, even the mummy are going to end up in somebody's tummy.
Yeah. Just
that's great cannibal lyrics.
Yeah. Super, super funny.
I am left with a question from this discussion about exploitation cinema. I think I brought it up before. It's definitely true of horror in general, but because horror, and especially things that we consider exploitation, are unhinged from the niceties of even the depravity of Hollywood, they might sometimes be able to touch another poetic truth. They're sort of the wild children. There's a freedom. And I wonder what we get when filmmakers make things that really make you question whether they're acceptable. You know what I mean? Movies that really push the bounds of good taste that are outside of the Hollywood system. As a result of being less controlled and less controllable, do they end up addressing things that respectable arts can't or don't? I come back to that a lot. I think it's often true. I think, the revolutionary nature of things like Chainsaw and Last House on the Left are able to do something that had never been done before. Speak to, I think people overly politicize some horror movies, but it's hard not to go like, yeah, the niceties of the 50s are defiantly over when you have a Last House on the Left. The blissful ignorance of the atrocities that Americans commit and are able to commit and always have committed are represented in things like Last House on the Left.
I've often found like that sort of track and conversation to be sort of like, there's an element that seems very like anecdotal to me. You know what I mean? Like one filmmaker, the small group of people who made this film, the small group of people with the money finance it, create this thing that is like an example of the moment. Like it's the zeitgeist film. And I think it's actually quite difficult to like engineer a zeitgeist film. Although, I mean, you can see that like with certain YouTube creators in particular are able to like engineer these moments. Like you'll have like all of a sudden Mr. Beast is everywhere, or like that Andrew Tate guy is everywhere, and then he's completely canceled. He was one of these like manosphere dudes who was like super everywhere for like a minute, and then he was completely deplatformed everywhere. Like one of the more recent like Alex Jones-esque, removal from polite society. It's interesting seeing that kind of happen to Kanye West for his latest crimes, whatever they may be. He was unbanked by JP Morgan Chase.
Whoa, what?
Allegedly for like, they didn't give any sort of reason, but like there's some speculation that because of his recent rash of anti-Semitic comments, JP Morgan unbanked Kanye West. It's kind of an evolving story, but the fun meme of it is like JP Morgan didn't unbank Jeffrey Epstein. So it's like, so I don't know.
Thank God I don't read the news.
I just like, I'm a Kanye West fan. So whenever he does something super crazy, I know that there's going to be an album dropping. I think he's both legitimately a crazy person and also our era's P.T. Barnum. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? It's like, he has an entire clothing line coming out, so he's going to grab as much attention as possible. White Lives Matter shirt. And it's so fucking crazy, but it's also not without precedent. Like a few years ago, he tried to reclaim the Confederate flag and make it his. So I don't know. It just seems like once you have just enough money, you can just like stick your dick into the most controversial shit for your own enjoyment.
Yeah. Well, backing away from him.
Before we back away from Kanye, if you were to stick your dick into some highly volatile cause and you were a billionaire, what cause would it be? And I mean that as a euphemism. You don't actually have to put your penis in anything. I just mean get in the mix.
I don't know. I think about this all the time, and it's hard to know where giving your money will actually have positive effect, because I don't want to shit on nonprofits as a whole, but so often you just find out about so much fuckery in nonprofit. Yeah. Charities are really difficult to find. It's like certain things, maybe like Doctors Without Borders or something like that. The Red Cross, like the old ones, the Stade, the True, those things seem to have really positive effects in the world. Mm-hmm. Or just, it would also depend on how much I'm willing to get involved, because it might just be like, just start a fucking scholarship. Just send some kids to school. That's going to probably do better than giving money to an organization that may or may not embezzle it or waste it on administrative fees or whatever. I don't know. I just don't know.
Yeah. It's interesting. Like you talk about like this, like the Red Cross and Doctors Without Borders, they like have a history of mobilizing around war. They're very old school. They understand their infrastructure very well. And it seems definitely a thing with like a lot of these like activist movements where very young people get elevated to these like huge positions, like your David Hoggs, for example, or your people who just like are pretty young and get elevated up. You know, they have more ideology than experience, maybe.
Yeah.
And a lot of that experience is just simply knowing how to make the trains run. You know, and because you know, you see like David Hogg, he was the kid that was involved in he wasn't involved. He was shot at in a school shooting situation, and you know, he wanted to take on the My Pillow guy. Like, and he was going to launch a liberal pillow company and just fucking incinerated, right? Because like they don't know anything about running pillows. Like how much money was burned up doing that could have been used for something else.
Yeah.
It's weird, but
maybe I would give it all to Greta Thunberg.
I kind of, you know what? I like the cut of her jib, and like she has a boat, so I guess it's literally the cut of her jib. But, yeah, like I like her whole thing. I think it's weird that people fixate on this like this well-meaning girl with like the most famous resting bitch face of all time. It's just super weird, and I think her reaction to it with the memes and playing along with it has been as good as you could expect from that.
Yeah.
Even though I kind of like, I think she's a crisis actor, you know. Not a real credit, you know.
Right.
Who knows? I just don't. It's just weird. It seems like if a movement builds fast and has a lot of money, like the accounting is always full of fuckery.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
or incompetence, or both.
Yeah, or a little bit of both.
I don't know if there's room to talk about it further. It might just be sort of like a semi-rhetorical question about whether or not exploitation cinema. You were talking about it's hard to engineer zeitgeists, and I totally agree. And I think that after the fact, we talk about Night of the Living Dead and civil rights. We talk about Last House on the Left and Texas Chainsaw Massacre in the light of Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems that none of those things were in the conscious minds of the artists when they made those things.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that there's not something going on where I think there's a significant thing that happens when an artist or artists take things too far and do it in a compelling way. There's always people taking things too far and doing stupid shit that pushes people's buttons. But if you're able to do it in a way that is memorable and actually affects other people and has a ripple effect, and therefore it starts to feel like part of the zeitgeist because it does ripple out and connect with the culture as opposed to just being an isolated thing that nobody cares about. And so the question is, when these things are taken too far, how much is it by default it's able to address things that nothing else can in a really gross way?
Yeah, it definitely doesn't feel intentional a lot of times. You know, like,
yeah.
And I think when people do set out to say things intentionally, it's often terrible.
It's often terrible.
Yeah.
It's true. But, you know, again, I'm sort of talking about when people are just raw, when people just lay it out and aren't trying to edit and monitor themselves. I think you get things that are really troubling and really interesting.
Yeah, I also feel like with these horror movies and these more like wilder ones, there's just like, there's not as many adults in the room.
Yeah.
So.
Often true.
Yeah.
All right. So Ralph was played by Sid Haig. Sid Haig was in a lot of Rob Zombie movies. Let's talk about Rob Zombie's The Munsters.
What a transition.
Thank you.
Yeah. This is another movie that has very intentional style choices that has created a sort of conversation. I'm going to say this now, in the way that I was correct about Tusk finding its own audience later and people would learn to love it. I think people are going to learn to love this. I think that people will dress up as Sherry Moon zombies, Lily Munster in the future with their titties half out in front of VHSs. I think it's for sure going to happen. And I think that this movie is enjoyable. Like, I like this movie.
Really?
Yeah.
Like, okay, explain what that enjoyment is.
Okay, so this isn't a 3-act. I mean, there's probably elements of 3-act structure here, but this is like a very like unusually paced, strange movie of the type that maybe would have come out in the 50s and 60s. It's before you get like Robert McGee teaching everyone, how a story should be written. And it's before anybody like decides they have to save the cat with these like very familiar Marvel movie beats. It's like you could frame every single Marvel movie. Like if you were to write out the story beats, I think every single one of them hits the same beats at about the same time. And this movie is just, even though it's like heavily rooted in an extremely specific source material, is doing all of its own weird shit. It's not like a totally insane horror movie like you would expect from Rob Zombie. It's funny in a way that people aren't funny now. Like this weird, like,
Yes.
like early Johnny Carson late night jokey shit. It has a bunch of strange overlapping anachronistic references.
Yeah.
That are just totally weird. I couldn't even tell you what happens. I mean, I don't know exactly. Like they lose their mansion and have to move into the house that starts the show. Who was asking for a Munsters prequel? Nobody. It's just so weird a thing that I appreciate that it exists.
I totally appreciate it too. I didn't enjoy watching it. I don't think I watched it in spurts more than 10 minutes long. I just couldn't.
Same.
It was so painful to watch for me.
I also found it painful to watch. But I also loved it.
I deeply respect it. One thing that I really respect about it is that in an era full of, now we're going on decades of weaponized nostalgia and prequels and reboots, it seems that there's no point almost in complaining about that anymore. It's like people are still buying them. People are still making them. It's just what's happening. It's just out there. And the question is, what are people doing with it? And I think with this, not only was nobody asking for this, it does not do almost anything that other reboots and nostalgia porn does. It does. Like I was thinking about Ghostbusters Afterlife. Is that what it's called?
Who knows?
Okay. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah,
Have you seen it?
Ruddbusters. Paul Rudd.
Yeah, no, it's weak.
Hey.
And I apologize. I'm borrowing a bit from Red Letter Media, their perspective on that movie, which is that everything. So when Ghostbusters was made, it was just a bunch of people improvising and clowning. Like, why did that person do that thing? Because there's one scene where Bill Murray gives, I think, Dan Aykroyd like a Crunch Bar as a minor gag. But then in Ghostbusters Afterlife, it's like, oh my God, the Crunch Bar, it's still in the pocket. And it's just, there's nothing funny. There's nothing, it's like all these gags are treated as if they're doctrinal and orthodoxy to great art. And they're not.
It's sentimental trivia.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or the Halloween reboots, Halloween and Halloween Kills. They do the same thing. Like, oh my God, there's the dog. He did it again. He killed and ate a dog. It's not important. That movie was made decades ago, and that was just something to be gross. It wasn't important, and it's not important now. Whereas this movie doesn't do any of that. It's not reverential with the Munsters. It is the Munsters. It could not be more in the spirit of the Munsters. Like, it might be more in the spirit of the thing that it's prequeling and rebooting than anything we've seen in the last 20 years. But also to a fault, because that stuff sucks and didn't age well, which makes it really interesting. He's like so dedicated to not just the Munsters of vintage property, but even the Munsters style of humor, which has aged terribly, which is fascinating.
There are a few really good jokes, though, that Herman tells.
I can't think of them, but
oh man, the best one is when he's talking about all the brand new glass side coffins, and it's like whether or not they're going to be popular in the future remains to be seen.
It's pretty good.
Like, it's so fucking funny. I just like, I found myself being like totally won over by these like gags and visual treatments, and like like he's wearing the going to the beach in the 1920s outfit, but it's like fucking super tight because he's gigantic. The sort of like costumery of the different scenes was interesting to me. The problem to me as a viewer, though, was some of the scenes are exceptionally long. And it made me think of, since we had talked to Peaches Christ and we had gone to Terror Vault, you know, those like bumper scenes that are designed to like time you, like the scene where you just go into a hallway and there's one actor and they're doing a routine to sort of like keep you from moving, to stall you from moving the next scene. Some of these scenes that don't involve them getting to 1313 Mockingbird Lane, they feel like that, like you're just being stalled, and they're very long, you know, like but they're also the sort of thing that a kid watching the Munsters in the 60s and 70s would have really thought about, like, oh, what is it like to see more of this creature from the Black Lagoon character? Like these really interesting, visually interesting characters you didn't see that often on the show or sort of explored more deeply in this movie. It's total fan fiction.
Yes.
Yeah.
Actually, I think Monique was the first person I heard say this, that there are Addams Family people and there are Munsters people. I am Addams Family people. And it's like, Addams Family is like for people who are into the Marx Brothers, and the Munsters are for people who are into the Three Stooges, right? And I was just watching both this morning, the originals, back to back, and the Munsters are all like, boing, you know, like facial expressions that go boing. Whereas the Addams Family is so dry. Everybody plays everything with a straight face. Something completely insane happens, and they just take it as normal. Whereas in the Munsters, something crazy happens, and they take it as normal, but are like, oh, ooh. You know, it's so hammy in a way that drives me fucking crazy. It just lacks any subtlety. And I think there's also a level that I'm invested in that is the difference between these two shows, which is the Munsters is just this family that's weird. Whereas the Addams Family, like, I think it comes down to how Gomez and Morticia are so in love with each other. They're so in love with each other, it's uncomfortable. And it's almost alienating. They're just so wrapped up in their love-struck world, despite how long they've been together.
Do you know the script note from the movie? Are you familiar with that?
From the Addams Family movie?
Yeah.
No, tell me.
Oh my God. There's a script note at the beginning that basically says, you know, before we get into this, you have to understand that these people, all they do is fuck. And they are absurdly horny for each other all the time, and that should show up on the screen like that. And if it doesn't, I'm going to walk from this project. And
amazing.
Yeah. And that to me is totally in the territory of like that Quentin Tarantino thing where it's like, there's all this information about the sword that you never see on screen. Like you never really see them like, you know, engaging in like 6-hour like tantric sex romps or whatever, but like it infects the show.
Totally. And I think that both those shows launching in 64, the Addams Family feels like this is the 60s to come, and the Munsters feels like this is the 60s that we want to leave behind and should.
Which one did you see first?
No idea, because they were both, when I was a kid, they were both always spinning. And I totally gravitated to the Addams Family.
I remember
the Munsters.
I was pretty young, like really young, like 4 or 5 years old when I first saw this, and they played it back to back. And I don't know that like when I was a really little kid that I understood that they were different shows.
Oh, sure.
Because they were like so similar. Like I kind of, and they played, I wasn't sure when it ended or whatever. So I don't really have like a strong preference for one over the other. There are specific things about them that I like better. Like I think the writing of the Addams Family is clearly better. And I like Gomez and Morticia. Their vibe I think is amazing. Uncle Fester, obviously undeniable.
So good.
But they're like, you know, but the things about like I love the monster cars. You like the monster car, like the
Dragula?
The Dragula cars.
Dragula's great.
Yeah, like that shit's super cool. I also like that they're monsters. I also like the niece or whoever who's completely fucking normal that lives with them. To me, that was always such a really exciting and interesting gag because I felt my life was like the opposite. I felt like this weird fucking person that lived amongst all these normal. So I kind of got the humor of that reversal as a kid.
That's cool. Although one thing about disliking the Munsters that I thought of when watching this prequel is that if Rob Zombie in some interview was like, yeah, I just wanted to prove how awful the Munsters was, he'd have nailed it. Like, the Munsters fucking sucks. I hate it so much. I made this movie. Look. Yep, it's pretty bad.
I don't know. I think it's hard not to feel how much he loves this movie in this movie.
I know.
You know, like for that.
It looks like it was so much fun to make.
Totally.
Like
totally.
I hate this movie, but I kind of wish I was in it.
How do you feel about like Sherry Moon Zombie and everything? Like, I love those posters where it's like Rob Zombie's Jaws and it shows like Sherry Moon Zombie coming up to grab the swimmer, you know?
Oh.
Yeah, there's all the memes are based on like a horror movie that Rob Zombie has done, and then Sherry Moon Zombie has an inappropriate part in it. Like,
That's pretty funny.
Like Rob Zombie's Nightmare on Elm Street, and she has the glove.
Right.
People feel really strongly about this.
I think she's great in it. I mean, she's not any better or worse than anybody else in it. She's fully committed. She's doing her thing. I find her acting just as irritating as everybody else is acting. You know what I mean? I think she's totally in it. She does this weird thing where she never stops moving. She's always like making her fingers dance around her face. It gets a little monotonous, but everything in this movie is monotonous.
It's exactly what Lily Munster does, like in the show does, though. So it's like...
Yeah. I mean, I think that this movie feels like there were no notes. I'm making assumptions, and this is completely untrue, but like it feels like there wasn't a lot of thought gone into it, and not a lot of like, hey, maybe you're doing that too much.
See what you're saying?
Hey, maybe you like, I feel like this movie was just made. Just like, I have an idea. I'm so fucking sick of being in quarantine that we're gonna make this quarantine movie with 5 people, you know, and 1 cinematographer, and it's just gonna be fun, and we're just gonna throw it together on my computer.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. I got some
gels on the lights.
Yeah, you have such a normie perception on this. It surprises me.
What?
I'm just kidding. No, but like there's a lot of like conversation about like how this is just bad, or he didn't know what he was doing, or it's the result of incompetent filmmaking, or like what the fuck's going on. And I just don't think that doesn't make any sense to me, because like his whole thing is an extremely curated aesthetic. Like everything, like from White Zombie on, all the videos and stuff. Like, so that to me is like shows intention. And you had mentioned it reminds me a little bit of, you had talked about our Unsane episode, and there was like all this conversation about like Soderbergh making a really janky looking film, and like he just didn't know what he was doing. It's like, no, this is like a master filmmaker, so it's hard to think that he wouldn't have made very specific choices.
I think that there are a lot of very specific choices in this movie, but I think that there are other choices that were slapdash and hurried and not effectively made, and I think the movie suffers for it.
I think that you could say that like you don't like those elements for sure, but I just don't know that it's like hurried. Like he had like not the budget that people thought he had for this, but he had a lot of time, pretty good amount of money. So to think that this movie would have fallen short of other examples of him like pulling off his vision with less money and less time, I think this is exactly how he meant to make it.
True. Okay. I think that can be true. And yet, if a movie of this clunkiness, caliber, however we want to frame its quality, was made by M. Night Shyamalan or Dario Argento right now, you would, of course, be like, this is a master filmmaker. But they're not in their prime. We've had this descent in quality for decades from all 3 of those filmmakers, right? Compare Suspiria to the last 10 Dario Argento movies. Compare Sixth Sense to anything. It's old by M. Night Shyamalan. These are filmmakers who've made incredible films and have profoundly declined to where they're making mockeries of their former selves. It's almost insulting to their own legacy that they continue to make movies that are so terrible. Rob Zombie hasn't made, that I've seen or been pointed to, a movie that is worth 2 hours of anybody's time since what?
I don't think
Devil's
any of
Rejects?
I don't think any of them. I think you have to like really appreciate specifically what he's doing to even enjoy these movies. I don't think that they're genre crossing masterpieces or anything like. I don't think he's ever made anything like that.
I mean, I think Rob Zombie's early films are very interesting, and there's a lot of control of the medium. I just sort of think that we're watching a filmmaker make progressively less engaging, less interesting, controlled films, and you can still respect him for following his own vision and having the determination and momentum and aesthetic focus to continue to hone his world.
Yeah.
But that can be parallel with him making worse films. And I think that this is a worse film. It's just a radical departure for him. And there's definitely very bold choices that I love. I think the lighting is awesome.
Yeah.
I think the set design and all that, it looks like a bunch of kids painted it on a Sunday afternoon to throw a community play the next day. They look awesome. They're so interesting and weird. And his adherence to this totally outdated form of humor and scene structure and all that, the acting being hammy in a specific way, in a dated way, I think is genius. I don't like it, but I think that's genius. What I think is not genius is this film as a whole. It falls really flat. It's really unengaging. And I think that is a mistake on his part. The first scene does not grab you at all. And that's very odd for like Rob Zombie, and a first scene can be whatever. A first scene can be melancholic and moody. It doesn't matter what it is. But Rob Zombie's newest film, the first scene is kind of boring and not that funny and not profoundly unfunny. And it's not connected to the plot, and it's not too disconnected from the plot. It's just slapped on. The preview for the film is in the credits, which seems
super weird.
And good for him for being weird, but I don't think it was a good choice. I think it's hard for it to not feel like that was just more footage that he didn't want to throw away. Yeah.
I can't.
I'm being very negative. But
no, I know, but like a lot of people are, and I can't help but feel like a lot of the things that people are mentioning they don't like, it's the most original shit that it's doing is the things that people don't like. Like, you mentioned Red Letter Media. They're usually like so spot on in a lot of ways, but they were discussing, I looked at an older video of them discussing the trailer when the trailer came out.
Yes.
The trailer seemed very unfinished or whatever. And they talked about like an option for the song and the trailer. They're like, well, he should have just got somebody who did trailers to do the trailer and it would be better. And what they describe is the most boring fucking trailer you've ever heard. They're like, yeah, you could take the song and like make it a little more interesting and maybe even a little more Addams Family or slow it down. And you're like, oh, like Ghostbusters Afterlife, like Stranger Things, like any of these like New Mutants, like they all use like the slowed down song that
Totally.
And it's like, oh, you're advocating for homogenization. Like that's what you're doing here.
It's funny you should say that because I was thinking about this. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, that Red Letter Media, How Did This Get Made? A lot of the YouTube podcast world of especially film critique that I think is sort of doing most of the interesting heavy lifting of film criticism currently. Part of what makes them very current and part of what makes them very interesting is they're very aware of tropes and film history and how all these parts fit together. And so they're able to dexterously pull things apart and reveal their components.
Yeah.
And
I have something to say about that, why it's fake and why Schopenhauer talked about it.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
But what I'm increasingly finding frustrating about all of that and finding its limits, and I hope that I am not doing the same thing, and that's why I've been thinking about it a lot. We
totally are.
Is that it's really easy to know the rules. The rules have been written since, what was the first book that you mentioned earlier? Not Save the Cat, but what's the
Robert McKee, but I think Save the Cat might be earlier.
Okay.
Yeah.
That we've had books that outline how to make a great movie or a great screenplay for so long now, and we are still following those mechanics such that when things don't follow those rules, it feels like something's wrong. And that's a fucking problem. That's like looking at a painting and saying that doesn't look like a peach, therefore it's a bad painting, right? But
there's also product design sensibilities, which are, do more people want a realistic peach in their home than not? I think about homogenization and good design often overlap.
That's totally fair. But let's just talk Western canon, right? Because it's easy. So much of Western canon does not follow those rules. And the retort is the most obvious, like, well, if you're going to break the rules, you got to know the rules. And if you break the rules, you got to do so properly. That's a rule.
Yeah.
Like, so it's just rules on top of rules.
Yeah,
and
totally.
it's all based on a fear of engaging with something that is unknown and hard to reckon with. And that's what I love about this movie, is that I hated the experience of watching it. I was fascinated with it because it broke so many common sense rules.
Yeah.
In a way that was hard to like reckon with my sense of good taste. You know, we talked a bit about this about Malignant, where Malignant breaks a lot of rules. Like you're watching one movie and then you're watching another, and then tonally you're like, well, what the fuck did I just watch? What genre is Malignant even? It doesn't even know what genre it is. It's like, no, you don't know what fucking genre it is because you're trying to adhere art to rules. And so this is all just to say that
People are going to remember Malignant.
exactly.
Yeah.
And anytime Red Letter Media or any YouTube criticizer, any podcast, including us, starts trying to criticize something because of its relativity to rules, I feel like that's the coward's way out.
Yeah.
But it's hard to not do.
Yeah. There's two things I think going on with this type of criticism. One is the algorithm in the platform itself is outrageously restricting. Like, for example, say you wanted to be a YouTuber and you wanted to make money and you wanted to talk about Spider Baby, and you had this outrageously interesting rape incest theory, right? Like, who knows what it would be, but like you're like, oh, this explains Hollywood. Obviously, you know, this is just incest stories popping out of Hollywood, you know, like something like that. Your channel would get like basically demonetized and you wouldn't be rewarded by the algorithm. But if you go and talk about like the black guy died first, wah, 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 like you're going to be rewarded for it. But you're rewarded in the same way of like not being a dick and being able to talk about the weather at the water cooler. You know what I mean? It's like a participation. You're part of mainstream massive society like that. And this is a piece of art that has to fit into that mainstream society. But the trickery is like things that are remembered have to be kind of weird. You know, like I look at, I like vintage cars. I like looking at all the Pebble Beach stuff, and the stuff that's the most interesting are like the concept cars that never really, really got made from those periods. Yeah. And you're like, wow, these are so radical and cool. But like, I will frequently like go pull the door on the wrong car when I'm going to the car with my wife. Cause like every SUV looks exactly the same to me. Like but those are like successful cars. Right. You know, where, you know.
Yeah. No, I think there's something in what you're saying, and pardon me if I'm flying in the wrong direction, but this seems to parallel the dead end of that so much culture that we take for granted at this point, basically nerd culture. You know, horror is enjoying another mainstream. You and I are certainly very invested in it. The MCU is the product of comic books, which were very looked down upon at their earliest peak moment. So we live in an era where so much nerd culture has won. Video game nerds won. Computer nerds won. Comic book nerds won. But they are still positioning those cultures as outsiders, right? There's this outsider feeling to actually most of what is currently mainstream culture.
Well, people want it both ways. They want like, they want to be the outsider hero, but they also want to be like the success. And it's like, there's a moment where they're happening at the same, but it's like being at the top of a jump on a trampoline. Like it happens for a moment and then it's downhill. Yeah.
Well, I was sort of thinking about that nerds online feeling victimized. People who go to Comic-Con still feel like they're outsiders, despite the fact that the products that they're most invested in take in the most money in cinema history. Nothing could be less outsider than that. You know, I remember this documentary called Triumph of the Nerds, which was about Silicon Valley, about these like nerdy outsider, basically math dudes who created computers as we know it, you know, and now those are some of the richest people on planet Earth, like in the history of humanity. They were outsiders. They're not outsiders anymore. They're actually the bullies, right? And why did I get onto this? What the fuck? I think it's about following. I think that a small corner of that is that there was something unique and interesting about, let's say, comic books at a certain point, but now they are some of the most formulaic myth making we have. There's nothing progressive or edgy about the MCU.
Yeah.
Almost.
I mean, I love comic books, right? Like I'm super into comics. I don't think comics are very good. I think they actually are quite stupid and juvenile in the main, and it's only really a few singular writers and artists in comics that are actually doing anything interesting. There's like hardly any. I think it's the same thing for film. It's like Rob Zombie is just not like a Polanski or a Tarantino or a Julia Ducournau or any of these like. But at the same time, he is an auteur. He's like a fan auteur. Like it's like a new thing. It's like him. I put him in like Kevin Smith and Eli Roth.
Yep.
Kind of in the same territory of like this, like a real, like, to me, there were like two paths of postmodernism. There's the one, let's take it all apart and fucking tear it apart. And, first shall be last, the last shall be first, that sort of thing. And then the other one is like a complete immersion and valuation of pop culture. Like as like the thing that is in front of me that was just made for me is the thing that's just as important as Chaucer is. And I think there's something valid to that. And like these filmmakers are making those things, but it's almost like they have suffered by not focusing on greater forms of art. Like this is my garbage in, garbage out thing again. It's like Rob Zombie's like programmed himself with the Munsters and schlocky horror. Can he make like a Silence of the Lambs or something? Probably not, but he's made all this other shit that's pretty rad. Like it's pretty good.
Yeah, I'm rooting for Rob Zombie.
His output is like a gastropub burger. Pretty stoked to eat it. Probably prefer In-N-Out, whatever, or an actual steak, but like this is great.
Yeah.
I like the bacon.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. What else?
I wanted to get back to this thing that we talked about a second ago, which was like, are we doing the same thing as other people? And I think that, yeah, you sort of are, but I think the thing that we do a little different.
You just said, are we doing the same thing? Yeah, you are.
No, I said we are. Did I say you are?
You said you.
No, okay. I often use you as like
I know.
Like whatever, but you certainly are, Mark.
Thank you.
No, but when I listen to somebody like a YouTube channel, there's a lot of YouTube channels now. They all have the same dumb Mr. Beast. The person looks surprised.
I do not know what Mr. Beast is.
Okay, so there's a style of thumbnail. You've definitely seen it. Like one person's on one side and they have their mouth open. They're like,
yes.
And then on the other side, so it's basically
like a woman with cleavage.
Yeah, or like
or
a centaur jumping on top of a GTI or something.
Right.
It's something nonsensical, right? And then it has the same font over the middle, and often you'll see they have like bold primary colors. So what that is the result of this YouTuber named Mr. Beast who.
Oh, okay.
So he pretty much cracked the code on thumbnails. Like he and some nerd buddies like autistically looked at YouTube for like 10 or 15 years and just figured out what makes a video perform better. So he could theoretically, like he said, like he could take our show and turn our show into a 1 million subscriber show like within 2 months, which the fact that he does it over and over again with his friends is like pretty fucking amazing, but it has this homogenizing effect. And you see all the podcasts of all like the sub Joe Rogan crew, the previously known as Death Squad guys, like your Theo Vons, your Tom Segura's and stuff, they all have the same style. And I think that like, to me, that sucks more than the Munsters movie does, that everybody's doing the same thing to reach the same performance level.
For sure.
But it makes it more interesting when something like Blazeball or The Backrooms comes out. You're like, oh, this is really radically different. But that shit doesn't do very well financially, even though it's so interesting. It just inspires someone who will later on go do a thing, which is the Harold Bloom anxiety of influence thing, which gets me to the Schopenhauer thing, which I wanted to talk about. This is like totally days of taking mushrooms, thought combinings happening at the time. I'm not on mushrooms today, though. I think if you study the rules of the art more than the actual art, you're going to get a very particular type of on-the-rails analysis where you're like analyzing things based on rules. And I think horror is really bad for it because of Scream.
Right.
Yeah, like there's a canonical horror film that introduces looking at horror films a certain way.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think everyone is doing that to some extent.
Absolutely. And I think consequently, I'm not making sorry. I am making excuses for us, is that it is a trap.
But and this is the Schopenhauer thing, is I think you and I, our educational failing is that we're mired in secondary literature.
Ouch.
Yeah. It's how the rhetoric department was taught. You know what I mean? Like you would like maybe read like 2 pages of the Judith Butler book that you should read the whole of. And then you watch a movie and then you read like 8 secondary material articles explaining the movie and explaining the Judith Butler thing, when you would have been better off only looking at that one movie and Gender Trouble for a whole semester.
Yes.
But no one does that.
Right.
Like, because people have this sort of like buffet table approach to learning things because nothing is more important than anything else now, you know?
Yes. That's interesting that you're putting it that way, because I'm in school right now, and my program has so far, none of my classes have secondary articles. I mean, I'm not reading Freud. I'm reading more contemporary stuff. It's science.
Of course.
You read the most recent text.
Yeah, the most recent original work.
But we're not I haven't read a single article except for my own pleasure. It's pretty much like, this is the book, write about the book, which I totally dig. Like I was talking about earlier, I'm not assigned articles about the DSM-5. It's just the book.
Yeah.
For better or worse.
But I think that's good, because you're going to, like with the Harold Bloom thing, like the closer you are to the source and you're interacting with it, the more legitimate it's going to be.
Well, I was going to ask, what have we learned? But I think you just summed it up.
All of us are, as a culture, engaging in like secondary and tertiary materials. And the reason why I wanted to pair Spider Baby up with the Munsters, for example, is this sort of like roundabout way of saying, like, just go watch the fucking Munsters. It was the original thing. And I did zero, I mean, you could probably tell from this episode, but I resisted the urge to go look at anything about Spider Baby, like other than like a couple of facts about like how much it made and whatever. But I think like I had more fun thinking about that than I did for example, watching Texas Chainsaw and then reading Men, Women, and Chainsaws, like, and having it explained to me. I think like if you think of yourself as an artist or an entertainer, you should be doing a little bit more work and should be a little bit more ahead of like the mass conversation. What does that look like for us? I don't know.
Yeah, fair. Is that it?
I think that's it.
We leaving it there?
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right, everybody. Email us at whatthe@scarythoughts.org. And thanks for listening.
Later. I haven't eaten anything today.
Oh, do you need something to eat?
No. I eat once a day. I have a 12 to 16 ounce ribeye and a pint of ice cream, and that is it.
What is the matter with you? All right.
It's really like a pretty solid diet.
No, fire your guru.